Deflect and Asteroid. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Bohacek. I'm from the Charles University in Prague, Czech Republic. I'm a member of the multidisciplinary research team tasked with developing a planetary defense strategy for the Czech government. I'm not going to be talking about legal aspects, much more of the political considerations and deliberations on the international level that I think are very much relevant to this discussion here. We heard the first day from Romana Kofler from the UNOSA that one of the biggest issues is who gets to decide about these planetary defense missions, and which is a problem because obviously the decision-making process has many issues. Deciding about global issues, we do not have much of a good track record dealing with issues, whether if it's climate change, whether if it's other problems, and you can maybe talk about that there's a problem putting these long-term things into the 4 to 5 year political mandates, or even, deciding over geographically indiscriminate threats in a system that is defined by territoriality, by nation states that are geographically pretty precise. But the study and the paper that I did was based on exploring 3 scenarios of decision making. One that is unilateral, other one that is multilateral, and a third one that is global. And I'm using several concepts of international relations and political science theory that I do not want to bore you with here. But one of the main important things here is that the critical security studies look at the way security and security policies are constructed. And they point out to the fact that they are socially constructed, and the way the threats are perceived and constructed depends on the context, on the actors that are participating in creation of the security threat perception, on the security policy, and let's say the whole processes and the consequences that are included there. In reality, we have national security concerns that are always, and national political systems that are always taking the security threat, whether if it's scientifically objective or not, and they have to introduce it into the political system. And they construct it as a threat to the nation state, always as a threat to the national security. And therefore, every country has their own views, the threat as a threat to national security, and they're mutually can be overlapping somewhere, but they're not completely mutually compatible, obviously, logically from the system. And to have a shared vision, a shared threat perception, it would, according to this theory, depend on having a political process that is inclusive and global, so we can have a global perception of this threat. We do not have that on the global level. We do not have a global security community because that assumes that we would have to have a shared identity, shared values, shared normative regimes, according to which everyone would have to ascribe. And you might say, well, we have international organizations, but they are, again, sort of conglomerates of national interests. They do not have authority to impose let's say, decisions. They have reflexive authority depending on demands, not orders. So based on these, theoretical, let's say, considerations, I looked at the different scenarios. The first one, unilateral. You heard about the legal aspects. My colleague Martin Schwetz, a lawyer, has a poster on the problems of unilateral planetary defense mission. The main concern from the political perspective is that it would dent the international space legal regime and could possibly lead to its fragmentation, rule-less outer space behavior, and so on, which is definitely something that we're not interested in. Most importantly, it would mark planetary defense efforts as an effort and a task for every single country. And obviously, every country would be interested and keen to preserving their sovereignty, preserving their survival and their security, which would lead to competition between these different planetary defense efforts without any consideration for collaboration to international law. And just the prospect of having one country saving the whole world obviously carries a lot of geopolitical concerns, a lot of concerns with power, because as we know from many experiences in the past, good intentions themselves, they are not sources of legitimacy, or they're not free of power, they're not free of national interests. So the main concern here would be rivalry between conflicting planetary defense missions, especially given the connection between between military use and space technology, and as well, many states not being able to ensure their security. Well, but from what I understand, the unilateral scenario is not very probable, as we are here at this conference talking about international cooperation. So the the multilateral scenario has obviously various aspects. One of the things that I want to talk about is the nuclear dilemma. We heard about legal problems. One of the main issues is that the nuclear use would essentially leave the fate of every nation on only 5 legal owners of nuclear weapons, which is which can be hardly ascribed as sustainable, given that every nation would be interested in having any means to influence their existence and survival. But the main thing with the international non-proliferation regime is the fact that the non-proliferation regime is built on assumption that you do not need nuclear weapons to ensure a national survival and national existence. Using them, or even just hinting or designing a spacecraft that would have the possibility of carrying nuclear weapons would send a signal that nuclear weapons are indispensable for the preservance of a state sovereignty. I can imagine the PDC scenario, the second there's an information that someone is designing a spacecraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons, we have North Korea or some other country dialing up Nigeria, which would be by 2029 the 5th most populous country, and telling them, why don't you take your fate and your whole existence in your own hands? If we can use nuclear weapons, we can help you out with it. So it is obviously carrying a lot of problems. The United Security Council, as well as the unilateral scenario, does not leave power and the fate of the rest of the world into one country, but into 5 permanent member states. And that's hardly describable. Hardly describable as a sustainable scenario as well. I mean, we can have many evidences and examples when the United Nations Security Council decided for the good of Africa or the good of people in Libya, Yemen, and Syria. So it's this dysfunctionality of United Nations Security Council would obviously translate into planetary defense, which is not a different scenario. And especially since the rest of the world is left out from that decision-making body. I think we can assume that every country would be interested in being able to preserve their opportunity or possibility to affect their existence in case of an asteroid threat. The next body we can talk about is the United Nations General Assembly, but here again, several problems arise. And one of them is that it is not a representative body, as not every different countries with different population, different economies have a different vote, and gaining, let's say, a consensus on that level is nearly impossible. And for all these scenarios, the risk is eventual fragmentation of the international community, because someone would be left out of the decision-making body. And if they're left out of the decision-making body or the decision-making process, they would be interested in finding other alternative ways to ensuring their security. It comes from the inherent problem that this system is based on national perception of the threat, which are not compatible. So it's very hard to find a consensus across these conflicting national perceptions of this asteroid threat. That leads me to the last topic, or the last scenario, which is the global scenario, which is a pure theoretical scenario based on some sort of inclusive, participatory global decision-making process, not because it's fair, because it's nice and democratic, but because it would create a shared perception through a shared global process, and it would create a perception of an asteroid threat that is similar, whether if it hits in Canada, in India, or anywhere else. It would avoid fragmentation. It would avoid of the international community. It would avoid rival planetary defense communities, because they are likely to emerge in case of a geopolitical interest that would definitely arise in case of planetary defense as well. And it would most importantly be a decision-making process based on the nature of the threat. We heard the first day that the asteroids do not discriminate. They do not discriminate whether geographically. However, our decision-making system on the international level is based on territoriality, on geographically defined political units that do not correspond with the global threat. And just to summarize these takeaways, I mean, the main concept upon which the international system is based is state sovereignty, and that's a concept from the 17th century. I'm not sure how many concepts from 17th century you are using for your work, but making political decision about planetary defense on this dinosaur form of decision making might not be the best way to deal with that, and much more suitable would be one based on reality, functionality, and principles than on geography. Because as we heard, the asteroids do not discriminate; they're completely geographically undiscriminate. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions? Approaching the mic.
It will be a difficult question, but how you distinguish between nuclear device and nuclear weapon?
Well, I think the term is nuclear explosion device, and I don't. The non-proliferation treaty just treats nuclear explosions as one, whether if it's as a weapon or whether if it's for peaceful uses of creating, let's say, tunnels, and that peaceful use was banned as well. So there is no distinction between nuclear explosive device and nuclear weapon.
Okay, and the treaty says that they can't fly through space or they can't be stationed in space, your nuclear devices.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but from my understanding is that they just cannot be placed and used in space.
Because all intercontinental
and exploded.
missiles
they cannot be exploded in space. That's the term.
They can't be exploded in space. But I mean, it's okay because for a case of war, we are not interested in exploding them in space. We are interested in exploding them in enemy territory. So, I mean, nobody would explode a nuclear weapon in space for a war purpose, I think.
No.
But for destroying satellites, you don't need a nuclear thing.
I would
okay.
I would like to ask a question in your in the paradigm you showed us, especially the global one. Where does the global economy fit in? Because the nation may be the affected nation may be miles away, and yet there may be significant aspects of one's own economy that might be tied to that nation. And would not that change the decision-making process you outlined?
Right. Well, I mean, the main assumption here is that any asteroid threat would have effects on the whole global economy. So it is difficult to have a decision-making process that only includes parts of the globe, which is in the current system. So that's sort of an argument for why we should have or think about a new system that is truly inclusive and incorporates all the actors, because everyone would be affected.